Hi, this is Drew Jones of Drewsguitarshop in Seattle, Washington, and today I wanted to talk about truss rods. This is a video that I've been meaning to do for a long time. It's one that's got a lot of things that I want to say, and I've been kind of putting it off because I've been trying to exactly think about how I want to do this video and not make it like 2 hours long. I'm going to go over a few things. Number one, I'm going to go over kind of why I don't want people who aren't luthiers touching truss rods. And I know that I'm going to get feedback in the comments because this is for some reason, a real emotional issue for some people. People like to get in there and do an adjustment to this part, even if they don't know what they're going for. And we'll talk about that in a little bit. We're going to talk about kind of the evolution of truss rods, why we, how they kind of developed over time, why we put them in the first place. And we're going to go ahead and we're going to talk about kind of how they work. And kind of in this first part where I'm talking about like why I don't want people to touch them, we're going to talk about some of the damage that can occur. So if you're here for, the other stuff, skip ahead in the video a little bit. You'll find it eventually. Me talking about like, kind of the evolution of these things and kind of how they work. But I do want people to stick around for this first part because this is important to me. This is an issue very close to my heart. I say that it's very close to my heart in a very literal, well, not literal, but it's a very real sense. I've seen a lot of very serious damage done to some very cool instruments over the years. That was done very quickly with a truss rod adjustment, and somebody not knowing what they were doing with it, or not having the right tool for it, or just in general kind of messing around where they shouldn't be messing around. Offhand, I'm gonna give you all a tip that's like kind of just a general mechanics tip. If you see a part in a machine and you don't know how to like measure when it's good, you don't know how to like, tell by ear or by feel or by measuring, what good looks like versus not good, don't mess with that part. Just if you don't know what it is, don't mess with it. It's real common sense kind of stuff. I'm human. I've done it too. I've gotten into stuff on my bikes. I've gotten into stuff on my cars that I've messed with, and I've regretted it. And I've ended up having to take it into a shop because I broke something or something was wrong or whatever. Like, it happens. We're all human. But in the case of truss rods, these instruments all have stories. They're all very, very cool things that we have in our lives that we kind of make our journey with. And in my opinion, we should be treating them with a lot of respect and a lot of love, and we should be doing our very, very best to get that instrument the care that it needs. If my cat gets sick, like, I'm not gonna sit there on like Wikipedia trying to figure out what's wrong with my cat. I'm gonna take her to the vet because I love her and I want her to survive and I want her to get the best care possible. And I know that I can't provide that care. And it's kind of the same thing with these instruments, guys. These are things that we should love and we should care for. And we are the caretakers of these instruments on this part of their journey. And they are with us and they will take care of us on our part of our journey. So, let's be kind to them. So, things that I have seen. I have seen fretboards popped completely off of necks. I have seen necks busted out in the back with like truss rods sticking out. I have seen cool old guitars with like one-way truss rods that are ridiculously hard to remove, where somebody has broken them off, at the nut with all of the threads coming with it, just busting off and it's completely making it unsalvageable. I've seen nuts that were not removable completely stripped because the wrong size wrench was used, or somebody was trying to go too hard with it and take it beyond where it should be. I have seen things like frets coming loose. I've seen things like nuts getting popped out. I've seen finish cracks. I've seen like weird kinds of like weird distortions in fretboards and things like that that are caused by these things being messed with in ways that they shouldn't be. And this is hard to deal with because, unfortunately, truss rods have a lot of mystique, a lot of what I would call superstition around them. People will tell you that these things do things that they don't. People will tell you that you adjust them to adjust things that they aren't necessarily related to, and you'll have all kinds of weird little things that you'll hear from people. Now, as far as like my own why should you listen to me on this? I've been, doing guitars for over 20 years now. I've been doing guitar repair for over 20 years now. And this started as kind of a long-term hobby for me when I was a teen, and went all the way up to me going to Roberta Venn School of Lutherie for it, and also then to go to work for a guitar manufacturer, high-end guitar manufacturer here in Washington. And then to kind of a sort of more gig thing where I was fixing up vintage instruments for stores in the area, and all the time kind of building my own client base, and now I have my own standalone thing that I do as a full-time job. This is my job, to know this stuff. So let's get into kind of talking about what the truss rod is now that I've kind of described kind of the horrific things that can happen. And kind of what we're looking for, where it came from, why we use it. I definitely wanted to put that first part in because I do want to discourage people from messing with this part of the guitar. I do. I really do. I really wish that more companies would put these things out of reach. I really do. It would prevent a lot of really sad things that I've seen. Anyway, getting on to kind of the evolution of the truss rod. So back when we started putting steel strings on guitars, we realized pretty early on that standard, just like a wood neck like we did on nylon string classicals back in the day, that wasn't really going to cut it for strength. So pretty early on in the process, you saw people kind of adopt these reinforcement rods. I call them reinforcement rods. Some people would call them non-adjustable truss rods. To me, it's not really a truss rod because it doesn't serve the same function that I would consider a truss rod to have. But it reinforces the neck and it gives it more stiffness so that it can handle the tension of steel strings a little bit better. And means that the neck is going to drift a little bit less. So, one of the problems with those necks that didn't have the reinforcement rods was that as string tension was pulled on them, and we're talking about a lot of tension. I don't know if you've ever looked at the back of a pack of D'Addario strings and added up all the string tensions for each individual string, but you end up getting something like acoustic guitar, you end up getting something like 140, 160 pounds. A lot of pressure pulling on that neck. And so what happened is if you didn't have that reinforcement rod, the neck would get kind of forward bowed over time, and it would get forward bowed over not so much time. And so this was a thing that needed correcting. So we started putting in these reinforcement rods so that didn't happen, and necks were more stable for longer periods of time in between refrets, and it worked for a long time. And even long past the point that most people had adopted adjustable truss rods, Martin notably kept their reinforcement rods in there for a long time. Martin's a really traditional company, and I think in terms of how Martin was thinking about it, they were thinking, well, we don't need adjustable truss rods because we get it right the first time, which is true. And, if these need adjustment later on, it should be done as part of a refret by somebody who really knows what they're doing, which, again, I don't necessarily fault that logic. I think that adjustable truss rods are better. I would not build a guitar with a reinforcement rod, but, I get their logic. I think I like the line that they're following there. Now, what people realized was that it would be really nice, if we could adjust the neck and neck relief with that truss rod once it was installed. And so the kind of more modern iteration of that came out, the adjustable truss rod. Most truss rods to start off with were just one-way truss rods. So you're talking about something that was like a bent strip of metal in a piece of wood, and with two little lock nuts on both sides, and you twisted one end to tighten it up, and it would kind of take curvature out of the neck. And that's kind of what we're dealing with most guitars, even today. One-way truss rods are great. And usually what you'll see in one-way truss rod guitars is that, like, you know, kind of at the factory, there'll be a little bit more relief sanded into it. We're going to get to the definition of that word here in a minute, don't worry. You'll see more relief sanded into it, so, you know, it can either go a little bit further forward, or it can come back and get the relief into where it needs to be. Now, let's talk about relief, because this is a big deal. When I get one of these guitars in that's been damaged in some horrible way because of a truss rod adjustment, like, again, fingerboards being popped off, necks being busted out and back, fingerboards being distorted, necks being distorted, things being broken off, things being like, cracked and whatever. Like, there's all kinds of bad stuff that can happen as a result of these. I ask the person, hey, what relief were you shooting for here? And they'll typically kind of look at me confused, and they'll be like, relief? And I'm just like, yeah, that's what that's there to adjust. The adjustable truss rod is there to adjust relief. One of the common things that you'll hear people talk about is that it's there to adjust action. It's there to adjust action, which most people are going to consider just to be the string height. When I say action, I'm talking about the action at the nut, I'm talking about the neck relief, I'm talking about the neck radius and the radius of the saddles, I'm talking about the string height off of the 12th fret. I'm oftentimes even including like the string gauges and stuff in that as well, because that's all going to affect the setup, the action on that guitar. I mean, it's all action. All of it's stuff that you feel, right? Like when you're talking about action on a piano, you're not just talking about how high the keys are, right? Like, I may be sounding so stupid right now to somebody who plays guitars, or plays piano, but you know what I mean. It's not just one thing. There's a lot of stuff in there that moves, that has to move together. So that's what that's there for. And so when I do a setup on a guitar, going in and adjusting the truss rod is one of those things that I do, but I'm doing it to adjust neck relief. And neck relief goes as a single part of the setup. That also includes adjusting the string height at the saddles, adjusting the nut slot heights, and adjusting the radius if it needs it, and checking out the shape of the neck and a bunch of other stuff. So, you know, this is one small part. A setup is not just going in and adjusting the truss rod. That's not how you do that. And we're going to talk about why that is in here in a second. So let's go ahead and talk about like kind of what relief is. So a lot of people have this misconception that guitar necks are flat, or at least ideally that they should be flat. This is not generally actually true. The one exception is like classical guitars. Some classical guitars you'll see having a flat neck in some cases. That's a different thing. We're not going to talk about that right now, because that's a different type of instrument. You're talking about something that's got nylon strings on it, that's got gut strings on it, that was, you know, designed for playing music like 200 years ago. We're talking about the modern steel string guitar here, and steel strings work differently. So anyway, getting on to what relief is. When we talk about a guitar neck, there's a shape that I want to see, a real subtle but definite shape. We're going to go ahead and draw a body here. This body could be an acoustic, it could be an electric, basically anything. This is where the neck joins the body right here. And that's going to become relevant when I talk about a thing called fall away. So our neck, we would like it to have a little bit of a subtle curve, a little bit of a forward curve to it until it gets to this body joint. And then we want to see a little bit of a downward ramp. Now this is a greatly exaggerated picture of what I'm talking about. This curvature, if we put a straight edge on top of it, would actually only be like 9 to 12 thousandths of an inch. Very, 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 very small, but it has to be there. And it has to be there because when you look at the way that a string vibrates, you'll notice that it doesn't vibrate, from point to point like this. It's not equal from like the saddle. Like you're not seeing the same amount of movement in the middle of the string as you're seeing out towards the saddle and nut. What you end up with is something that looks more like this. Hardly any movement, more movement, more movement, more movement, and then it peaks at the middle, and then it kind of goes down again. And in the middle of the string, you see that big part where it's got the most movement. Well, if you just have a straight neck going under that, you realize that like this gets kind of close. And what'll happen is as you pluck those strings, especially the bass strings, they'll rattle against the top of those frets, which is bad. That creates a sound that's definitely terrible to listen to. And so what we do, instead of having that flat neck, is we put a little bit of that curve in it. So it kind of contours with that shape. And so that's what that's in there for. Now you may ask, well, you know, doesn't that really only matter if the string is at that length, or what happens when you fret it? Well, as you fret it, this gets less and less. So the higher the note is, the less of that up and down vibration that you're going to be getting in that ellipse that's going to be banging against the top of the frets. And so as this relief tapers off towards the body joint, you know, when you're fretting it, so does that elliptical pattern of the vibration. So this is what neck relief really is. This is a part of the setup that's very important, because if this is not present, if this little bit of forward bow isn't present, you're not going to be able to get the strings down as low as you want them. You're going to have to adjust for not having that relief by setting the strings up higher, which I don't think anybody really wants. Setting that relief allows you to get the strings down lower to the board and allows you to get a more comfortable setup all around. So that's actually a pretty crucial bit to making the setup more comfortable for the player. And so that's a thing that I spend a lot of time looking at. Now, I'm going to touch on this just for a second. I'm going to come right back to this. This fall away here, I just want to talk about this for a second. This fall away is a thing that I think Martin started doing this back in the day. And it was because they realized that as guitars age, the neck kind of comes up and eventually it ends up here. And so if you don't have this, what you end up with is kind of a ski jump shape. And then everything in here ends up hitting those bottom frets. And so if you've played a guitar that had that issue, look for that ski jump. That may be a thing that you want to look for. And you'll look for it with a tool that I'm about ready to talk about. So when I do this adjustment on a guitar, adjusting for neck relief, what I'm going to do is I'm going to get the strings kind of set up about where I think that they should be, you know, kind of about ballpark, not necessarily exactly. Get the nut carved down, get the strings tuned up to tension. So I want them stretched out, I want them tuned up to where they're going to be pitch-wise, so that they can pull the proper amount of neck, because the neck on the guitar is kind of like a spring. This curvature is largely dependent on how much pressure the strings are allowed to, you know, how much of the string pressure is allowed to pull that neck forward. And so that tuning is important. Get to that maybe a little bit later, but it's why we don't just do a setup and then randomly change the gauges of the strings and randomly change the tunings. But when I set that relief, what I'll do is I'll do all of those things, and I'll get the guitar into playing position. So I'm having it up like this, and then I'll take this guy and I'll lay it across the frets. And this is like a $60 tool. This is a machinist straight edge, and this is the kind of thing that most people don't have lying around their house, which is why, like, I usually kind of cringe inside when I hear somebody talking about doing their own truss rod adjustments. I'll ask them, what relief are you shooting for? I don't know. Do you have a straight edge? No. Well, this is the tool that you use for measuring that relief. You get it up into playing position, you lay this across the board, and then you take these guys out. This is a feeler gauge for you car mechanics. You're probably going to recognize this as the thing that you might use for gapping your spark plugs. You know, these are just little sheets of metal that are cut at a specific height. So this is 9K, I've got 10K, 11K, and 12K, and I do have some higher ones in here that I'll use for some things, not usually guitars. But you know, those are that's kind of the range that you'll see on guitars. Different reliefs will be put in for different things. So that's the other thing about doing this kind of adjustment, is it's not always the same relief that you want to put into a guitar regardless of what it is. It's going to be something different based on the tension of the strings, based on the scale length of the instrument, based on like what tuning you're using, based on all kinds of stuff. You want more or less relief. And kind of what it's dependent on is how floppy the strings are. and just how much movement is in the middle, and that's going to largely determine what we're doing. So what I'll do is I'll lay this straight edge onto the fretboard while it's tuned up to pitch, and then I'll take one of these guys, the ideal one, and I'll slip it in between that straight edge and that fret, that 7th fret. This is a measurement that actually takes a little bit of skill. It's very easy to cock this thing to one side or the other and kind of get a false reading on it, because what you're looking for with a feeler gauge is a little bit of grip on both sides. And if you angle it, it's going to grip in ways that it shouldn't. So you need it to be running through very straight. And so it's a feel thing. You need to do this a few times in order to kind of get a sense for like what you're doing. And so this is a thing that kind of requires some skill too. So that's what I'm going to be doing, is I'm going to be going in and I'm going to be adjusting that truss rod until, with the strings tuned up to pitch and everything ideally kind of around where it should be, I get the relief that I want to see. And then once I get that neck relief, then I'll go in and I'll set the string height and I'll set the string radius and other stuff with the setup, pickup height and all the other stuff that comes along with it. But that's that's how I do that truss rod adjustment. It involves these two tools, and involves my eyes. It involves kind of my just years of like, okay, well, if we put this here, this is about where it's going to need to be anyway. Kind of predictions just based off of doing things for a long time. But that's what we're going for. And it does really, in my opinion, kind of necessitate having a straight edge of some kind. It's one of those things that you just can't get away from. If you're going to be doing guitar setups, you're going to have to get a straight edge at some point. You're going to have to get a real straight edge, good feeler gauges, and you're just going to have to be able to use them. It's part of doing a setup. It's part of doing those adjustments. So that's how that's done, and that's kind of how it should be done. If you're not using a straight edge and you're not using feeler gauges with your truss rod adjustments, you're not going to be able to do a very good job of it, even if you do know what you're going for. There are some folks out there that'll do it by eyeball, so they'll touch the string at the 12th fret and they'll touch it down on the 1st fret and they'll kind of eyeball at that 7th fret and see what they can get. But it's very, very difficult to really look at stuff that's like thousandths of an inch and really gauge it accurately. Your eyes can play tricks on you. Personally, I'm a big believer that eyeballs are one of the worst, things that you can use for measuring something. I say that as somebody who measures by eye all the time, but the main reason I say that is because, like, if you ever looked at one of those like optical illusions things online, and you realize how easy it is to trick eyeballs into doing all kinds of crazy stuff, you realize that maybe you shouldn't be relying on them for fine measurements like that. So that's my take on it anyway. We talked about the things that can happen. We talked about kind of the evolution, and now we just finished up talking about like kind of how that adjustment is really done. I want to talk about tools here for a second, just because I know for a fact that some of y'all are going to go out there and do this anyway. There's a variety of different truss rod sizes that you're going to see out there. I have over here a couple of number of wrenches that are kind of custom. I typically don't have to work too far outside of these. I've got some wrenches up here too. But, for Gibsons, you'll typically see one of these little guys, or for Taylors, you'll see one of these little guys. This is about a 1/4 inch, and I think, what is this? 5/16, I think this is for the Gibson. And then, for Martins, you've got this big guy here. Martin has done this cool thing, at least I think it's cool, where they put the truss rod way behind the transverse brace, and so you have to like go all the way up in there with that big long thing to get in there and tune it or turn it, which is I think great, because it means that I get less Martins in here, popped off fretboards and busted out necks. This is a Laravey truss rod wrench, and again, you see that they kind of made this hard to get to. You got to actually go around the transverse brace to get to their truss rod nut and adjust it. I actually really like this idea too. That's kind of what you're going to be using for it. Now, in terms of like, fits, for some of you folks who do kind of more mechanical things, you're going to know what a good wrench fit feels like. Like when you put something on, it's going to be a little bit of play to it, but not a whole lot. You're going to be able to turn it and get good, solid movement all the way around. That's what you're going to want if you're doing it. And you don't want to take something in that feels like loose. If it feels too loose, it may mean that the tool that you're using is too cheap and it's just not sized correctly. Or it may mean that you're trying to operate something that's metric with an imperial wrench or vice versa, or it may mean that there's some kind of custom size there, because I have run into guitars that had like, weird custom size things. And once in a while you'll see that on a truss rod. A very long while. But yeah, you gotta make sure that fit is good, and you gotta make sure that you have the right sense of what you're going for. So like if you're going to do this adjustment, you're going to learn how to do it. Get a straight edge, get those feeler gauges. Those are going to be what you need. That's going to set you up right with this. You may see people on the internet who say that you don't need these things, or just talk about doing it some other way. Every single teacher that I worked under, every single person who I have studied under, who I've worked with, who has done this for a living, this is our tool set. This is never varied in any shop that I've ever been in. This is how we do it. If you see somebody doing it in some way other than this, chances are they're not doing it correctly. And chances are the advice that you're getting from them is maybe a little suspect. So remember, popped off fretboards, busted out back of the neck, distortions, finish cracks, things getting twisted off and broken, things to the point where you have to like go in and pull a fretboard off and extract a truss rod and figure out if you can find a new one to put in there, because maybe they don't make that one anymore. Maybe you got to go in there and route it for a new truss rod, a new style of truss rod, because you can't get that old style anymore, and you end up like doing this whole thing that could have been like a $60 setup, but instead now you're dealing with like a $300-400 repair job. Just don't do it. I have a truss rod here, and I just wanted to kind of show you all how this kind of works. This here is a two-way truss rod. This is a little different than kind of those one-way truss rods that I was talking about. But if you kind of want to know what these things are doing on the inside of the neck, this will give you kind of a taste. So if I take this and I twist it this way, I get this curve up here. You see that? If I twist it back, it goes away, and then I twist it and it comes back. So this truss rod would probably be installed with this flat end up, and this flat end would be sitting against the bottom of the fretboard. And as I twisted it, righty-tighty, lefty-loosey, I tightened it, going to the right. It's going to take relief away from the neck as it kind of forces the middle of the neck to bow. If you go in here and you squeeze, you'll realize that this is actually a lot of tension. And if all of this was captive, as in it was like inside a slot, like it would be a lot more tension than even you're feeling if you just do this. And this is already kind of a lot of tension, like building up inside the neck. Now, this is a two-way truss rod, so if I go this way with it, I also get a curvature on the bottom. And so this, if I twisted it like lefty-loosey, this one actively puts more relief in the neck. This one actively forward bows the neck by bending this in the middle. Most don't work this way. Most are one-way truss rods. If you do encounter one with a two-way truss rod, chances are it works just like this one. Be careful with two-way truss rods. Sometimes they work in reverse from righty-tighty, lefty-loosey. You'll kind of have to play with it and see. Kind of wish that was more standard. It is pretty standard, but it's once in a while you'll run into something that's got a reverse truss rod. And I worked at a factory where we did reverse truss rods, and it was a little weird. Anyway, so that's how that works. Is it just basically you tighten a thing between two captive points. You got a captive nut here and a captive nut here, and this piece of thing adding tension to it causes it to bend, because that's just what happens. But that's how that works. If you have a one-way truss rod, basically what's happening is that the neck itself is serving the same purpose or the same function as like this bar that's holding these captive nuts, because the captive nuts are like basically embedded into the wood of the neck. And so by tightening the truss rod, you're still causing that curve to happen, but it's the neck itself that's kind of making that magic happen. But yeah, that's basically how that works. Just kind of wanted to briefly show you guys, you know, how that kind of functions, just so that you kind of have an idea of what's in there. So yeah, this is a thing that I'm really passionate about, because it's a thing that I tend to see done bad a lot, and it's a thing that I tend to see cause injury. I have almost never gotten a guitar in here that the client told me that they messed with the truss rod where like the neck was sitting anywhere close to where it should be. And in a lot of those cases, a fair percentage of them, we're talking like probably probably 1 out of 10, maybe more, has some damage associated with it. So has some stripped nut, has a, you know, thing that's broken or getting ready to break, has a fretboard that's popped off a little bit, little distortions, whatever. It has some problems, structural problems that have been created by going in there and doing that. And then I have to go in there and fix that stuff. And that stuff can range anywhere between like $40 fixes to like $400 fixes. So my recommendation is that, like, if you don't want to get into that territory where you're doing like the $400 fixes, take it to a shop. I will absolutely adjust somebody's neck if that's all it needs for free. I will do it and I will hand it back to you, and good. It's been done by somebody who's done thousands of these, and I'm going to be able to tell much better than somebody who hasn't done thousands of them, like where the stress is going to be too much, and you know, where we're going to run into problems. Setups are cheap. Structural repairs are often not. So, you know, also weigh that if you feel like getting in there and doing this. By and large, I would just suggest, in general, again, if you don't know what a part does and you don't have the tools to measure the effects of that part, don't go in and mess with that part. You run the risk of seriously damaging an instrument, at the very least throwing your setup completely out of whack, because too much neck relief is going to cause just as much buzzing as too little neck relief. And, you know, the only thing that people tend to notice is that the strings move up or down when they do this. And, you know, that's kind of all anybody seems to pay attention to. So, I don't know if I've changed anybody's minds watching, you know, by talking about this for as long as I have. I really hope that I've at least discouraged some folks out there from going in and kind of willy-nilly taking tools to their guitar and possibly, you know, saving some of you from some damage that could happen as a result. I hope that you took what I said here to heart. And like I said, I know that I'm going to get comments down in the comments talking about why I'm wrong. All I can say is that I gave my credentials here. I'm pretty open about them. And, you know, like I said, every single shop that I've worked at, this is the way that we do it. Every single professional that I've ever worked with, this is how we do it. The only people that I've ever seen talk about doing this any other way are people that are like working on their mom's dryer, or, you know, folks that have just been messing around with stuff, or folks that are bringing me something that's broken, like sometimes broken because they did this. So save yourself the trouble. Take it into a shop. If it just needs a truss rod adjustment, chances are the guy that's in behind the counter is going to do it for free and just hand it back to you. At the very least, yeah, maybe recommend a setup for you. And worst thing that can happen is that you take it in and you get a full setup done on it, and you have an awesome playing guitar afterwards and nothing is broken. So, yeah. Anyway, this has been Drew Jones of Drew's Guitar Shop in Seattle, Washington. There's a link to my Ko-Fi and my Patreon in the description of this video. If you found this helpful and you want to kick me a few bucks, that would help me out a lot. And there's also a link down there to my Reverb page where I sell some vintage instruments and used instruments that I've really gone through, and I've set up and done, upgrades to and all kinds of stuff. They're not going to be the cheapest used or vintage instruments that you find, but they are going to be ones that are among the top players that you find. I also have a link down there to my website, which has a page for caring for stringed instruments. So if you are watching this, I'm going to guess that you probably have a few stringed instruments that you are taking care of. And so that might have some advice that's useful to you. There's also a link there to, in my website, you'll also find the page that has my pricing info for doing setups, restrings for whatever, Again, I'll just do truss rod adjustments for free. You just want to have done, I'll just send you out the door with it. But that's there. And you have my contact page there also if you want to contact me about doing some repairs. Now, I do want to say something real briefly, just because this has been kind of coming up more and more as the channel's been getting more popular. If you have a long form question, something that's like more than like 3 or 4, I'd say more than like 2 sentences, I prefer to get those via Ko-fi or via Patreon. It does take time for me to answer those questions or to sit on the phone with somebody, and I'm happy to do it. I'm absolutely happy to answer complex questions, but I prefer to be paid for my time. I think that anybody out there who's works in skilled work can kind of understand where I'm coming from with that. If it's just some like one-off thing, like a sentence or something, I'll try to get to it when I get to it. I get around to the answering comments in these videos eventually, and hopefully I'll get around to it. Anyway, there's lots more videos like this on my channel, some of which might be useful to you. Please go around, check those out, and link them to friends if you got friends who are into this kind of thing. That really helps me out here. And otherwise, this has been Drew Jones of Drew's Guitar Shop in Seattle, Washington. Thank you for watching.